More than 10 billion crayfish are being raised right on agricultural fields in China, a paradox that many European countries find almost impossible to accept, because this small crustacean is precisely the culprit that hollows out rice field banks from below, destroys irrigation systems, eats native fish eggs, and can collapse an entire freshwater ecosystem within just a few breeding seasons. With a spread rate that is nearly out of control, crayfish have turned many areas in Europe into devastated battlefields, forcing governments to spend millions of dollars each year on large-scale eradication campaigns. Yet time and time again, they still come back, an invasive species that is nearly impossible to eliminate. So why, instead of removing them like most of the world, has China chosen to farm crayfish on a massive scale? What turned an ecological nightmare into a billion-dollar industry? Originating from the southern United States, especially the swampy regions of the Mississippi River Basin, crayfish were once just a familiar part of native wetland ecosystems. But it is precisely that harsh environment that unintentionally equipped them with survival abilities that become extremely dangerous when they appear elsewhere. They can dig burrows as deep as 1 to 2 meters underground to escape drought and cold, survive in low oxygen waters that many native species cannot tolerate, and feed on almost anything, from aquatic plants to fish eggs and larvae. Even more concerning, each female can lay between 300 and 600 eggs per clutch, reach maturity in just 3 to 5 months, and reproduce multiple times within a single year. This combination of traits has turned crayfish into a perfect candidate for large-scale biological invasions around the world. And in the northern United States, these invasions are already taking a heavy toll, causing agricultural losses of more than $20 million every year. In the 1970s, Spain imported red swamp crayfish from the United States with the goal of increasing farmers' income and making use of wetlands that were difficult to cultivate. But within just a few years after being released into the wild, they had spread more than 500 kilometers along the Guadalquivir river system in southern Iberia. In the Doñana wetlands, one of Europe's most important ecological reserves, this small crustacean quickly disrupted aquatic vegetation structures and sharply reduced native amphibian populations, species that depend directly on the stability of shallow water ecosystems. From there, they continued spreading into Italy's Po Valley, the country's largest agricultural hub in the north. Their deep burrows began weakening field banks and causing water leakage in irrigation canals stretching thousands of kilometers. In the Emilia-Romagna region alone, damage to irrigation systems has exceeded 10 million euros per year, forcing local authorities to continuously reinforce canal banks and control invasive populations. Along with their spread, red swamp crayfish also carried a nearly invisible threat. Astonishes astaci, the fungus responsible for crayfish plague, which has completely reshaped the history of freshwater crustaceans in Europe. Unlike Native American crayfish species that have natural resistance, European species such as Ostropodimobius palipes have almost no defense mechanism. Once infected, mortality rates can reach nearly 100%. Within just a few decades, many native crayfish populations have disappeared from freshwater ecosystems where they had existed for thousands of years. A small creature, but powerful enough to reshape the ecological structure of an entire continent. The reason Europe quickly lost control of red swamp crayfish lies not only in their rapid reproduction, but also in the very structure of the continent's freshwater ecosystems. Unlike their native environment in the southern United States, many wetlands in southern Europe lack effective natural predators to keep their population in check. At the same time, extensive networks of rivers and interlinked irrigation canals have unintentionally become natural dispersal corridors, allowing populations to spread at an alarming rate. Within just a few decades, this crustacean has appeared across most freshwater ecosystems in the Mediterranean region, forcing many southern European countries to implement long-term multi-generational control programs. Spain and Italy have deployed large-scale trapping, seasonal canal draining, and restrictions on transporting live specimens in an effort to slow population growth in the wild. At the continental level, the European Union has classified this species as an invasive alien, species of union concern, one of the most strictly regulated categories under EU environmental law, and has imposed bans on commercial farming and large-scale production expansion. However, despite such aggressive measures, most control programs have only achieved temporary results. While Europe continues to struggle to contain this invasive species, in China, the very same crustacean has opened the door to a completely different turning point. As early as the 1930s, red swamp crayfish were introduced into China via Japan as part of aquaculture experiments influenced by farming models from the southern United States. However, it was not until decades later when farmers in Hubei province began searching for ways to improve the efficiency of rice cultivation that this species truly entered the agricultural production system. Instead of removing them from rice fields as a potential pest, farmers adjusted the very structure of the field so that rice and crayfish could coexist within a single integrated farming cycle. Water trenches about 30 to 60 centimeters deep were dug along the field edges to maintain stable water year-round and provide shelter for the crayfish, while the upper field surface continued to grow rice under normal cycles. In this environment, crayfish mainly feed on weeds, pests, and organic residues in the field, significantly reducing the need for pesticides without negatively affecting mature rice plants. With a typical stocking density of around 15,000 to 30,000 individuals per hectare, the rice crayfish integrated farming model can produce between 300 and 600 kilograms of crayfish per crop, while maintaining stable rice yields. More importantly, from the same piece of land, farmers no longer harvest just a single product as before, but instead generate two parallel sources of value within one field: rice in the upper cultivation layer and crayfish in the water layer below. From a local experiment in Hubei, this model quickly spread to many other rice-growing regions across central China, transforming a species once considered invasive into an integral part of a regional agricultural system. At present, China produces approximately 2.8 to nearly 3 million tons of crayfish each year, accounting for the majority of global crayfish production. Hubei province alone has become the world's largest production hub, where the rice crayfish model is no longer a local experiment, but has evolved into a region-wide agricultural system operating continuously across seasons. During peak season, crayfish are not harvested in batches like many other aquaculture species, but are instead trapped and collected almost daily. This high-frequency harvesting cycle creates a natural population control mechanism. The reproduction rate of this notoriously hard-to-control species is now outpaced by the rate of human harvesting. In peak months, a single major city can consume between 200 and 300 tons per day. When market demand reaches that scale, a species once considered an ecological nightmare in many parts of the world becomes directly integrated into a food production chain worth $40 to $50 billion annually. This is how an invasive species is transformed into a national-scale industry. Leaving the rice fields, crayfish enter a large-scale industrial processing chain. At processing centers in Hubei, Jiangsu, and Anhui, raw materials are typically fed into production lines within just a few hours after harvest to preserve freshness and minimize biological quality loss. At the initial receiving area, workers stand along fast-moving conveyor belts, quickly sorting crayfish by size to direct them into appropriate product streams. From here, the crayfish move through a multi-stage washing system operating continuously. High-pressure spray nozzles mounted above automatically remove mud and debris clinging to their shells, traces of the paddy field environment where they were just harvested. This continuous washing process allows factories to handle large volumes of raw materials while maintaining stable line speed during peak season. Once cleaned, the crayfish enter a preliminary heat treatment stage. They are briefly boiled in water at around 85 to 95 degrees Celsius to stabilize the meat structure and loosen the bond between the shell and the body. This is a critical step that makes the peeling process faster while preserving the integrity of the meat. The product then moves into the shelling area, one of the most labor-intensive stages of the entire line. Workers operate along long processing tables, quickly separating the tail from the hard shell to extract the most valuable portion of the meat. This manual peeling process helps maintain the structure of the meat, something fully automated systems still struggle to achieve with small crustaceans like crayfish. In the packaging section further down the line, many operations are still performed by hand to ensure precision in product arrangement. Workers place the crayfish meat into trays moving along conveyor belts before transferring them to vacuum sealing systems or preparing them for rapid freezing. This combination of flexible manual labor and semi-automated systems allows many facilities to maintain processing capacities of 20 to 50 tons per day during peak season. After packaging, the products are transferred into deep freezing systems to preserve the meat structure throughout cold chain transportation. From this point on, crayfish are no longer mainly distributed as whole animals, as in traditional local consumption models, but are instead transformed into standardized products such as peeled meat, frozen tails, or ready-to-cook items for modern supply chains. It is this standardization process, carried out directly on the production line, that has completely redefined the role of crayfish in the production system, enabling them to integrate seamlessly into global food distribution networks. But the real turning point for crayfish did not happen in factories. It happened at the dining table. In Hubei, crayfish entered urban life in large, steaming woks set up along summer night streets. There they are stir-fried with bright red dried chilies, minced garlic, Sichuan peppercorns, and thick spicy sauce, creating xiaolongxia, one of the most iconic symbols of modern Chinese night dining culture. This is not a luxury dish. It is food for long, crowded tables, for laughter that lasts deep into the night, where people peel each crayfish by hand, letting the spicy oil coat their fingertips before reaching for another. It is precisely this style of eating that drives consumption to grow exponentially. In just about 2 decades, xiaolongxia has evolved from a local dish into a large-scale night economy. In Wuhan alone, during peak season, consumption can reach tens of thousands of tons per year. A similar story has played out in the southern United States. In Louisiana, crayfish are boiled in massive pots with corn, potatoes, and rich Cajun spices, then poured directly onto long tables where people gather around for a true crawfish boil. The similarity lies not in how they are cooked, but in how they are eaten. When a species enters meals designed for eating in large quantities, over long periods, and in groups, it is no longer just an ecological issue. It becomes part of urban life. And it is this massive demand that creates a rare form of natural population control. In fact, China once went through a period of damage very similar to what Europe is experiencing today. During the 1980s to 1990s, in many rice-growing regions of the Yangtze River Basin, such as Hubei and Anhui, crayfish dug dense burrows beneath the fields, causing irrigation leaks, weakening embankments, and reducing yields by about 5 to 15% in many traditional farming areas. In that context, local farmers began catching them, initially just to reduce their population in the wild. But very quickly, the large volume of harvest turned this species into a readily available local food source. Consumption within the region gradually increased, then spread to urban centers in central China by the late 20th century. As market demand surged, wild harvesting transitioned into integrated rice crayfish farming, eventually developing into a nationwide, closed-loop production system. A species that once damaged rice fields was absorbed into the production system instead of continuing to exist as an invasive species in the wild. Meanwhile, in Europe, low consumption levels meant that harvesting pressure was not strong enough to reduce population density. The species continued to spread in natural environments, damaging irrigation systems, reducing native species, and causing millions of euros in losses each year to water infrastructure across major agricultural regions. And it is precisely this difference in human response to the same invasive species that has led to 2 completely different outcomes. Europe's battle with red swamp crayfish is unlikely to end anytime soon. Once an invasive species has spread across thousands of kilometers of rivers and irrigation systems, complete eradication is no longer a realistic option. But this story is not just about a small crustacean. It is a warning for any country that considers introducing a foreign species without fully understanding the ecological risks involved. In many cases, the consequences do not appear immediately. It can take years, even decades, before they unfold into a full-scale environmental crisis. However, China's experience shows a different path. Not every invasive species must be completely eliminated. In some cases, if the habitat, population density, and especially market demand can be controlled, a species that once caused damage can be brought back into the production system instead of remaining a threat in the wild. That is not an easy solution, but it reveals another possibility. Sometimes the most effective way to control an invasive species is not to remove it from the ecosystem, but to integrate it into the human economic system. And that difference in response may determine whether an introduced species becomes an ecological disaster or a new resource for society. A small crustacean that once crossed oceans only to become a rice field destroyer and then turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The story of crayfish shows that the future of an invasive species is determined not only by the organism itself, but by how humans respond to it. One wrong decision, and it becomes an ecological disaster. The right strategy, and it can become a national resource. And this is just one of many silent battles unfolding around us. If you want to explore more stories like this, don't forget to like and follow Mandarin Tech.